in terms of legal relationships. And now we are moving to a completely different type of thinking in which we not only that are looking at animals, we are not looking at only at entities that can express themselves very, very clearly in a dialogue with the humans, but we go.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. My name is Isabella. I am the co-host here with Manuel, another co-host, also the executive director at the AKFI, and also our special guest today, Professor Leaua. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thanks to this talk series, we get to connect with great minds to together discuss the current state and the future state of sustainability, ESG, and digital transformation. Professor Leaua teaches new technologies law and comparative international arbitration law for students in informatics, economics, and the law of the Bucharest University of Economics. And with the PhD, Professor Leaua has a PhD in law from the university, and she's also graduated executive education programs at Harvard University, John F. Kennedy School of Government, and London School of Economics. Very pleasure to have you today, Professor. And let's get into the conversation to talk about the future of environment and the environment law. Can you elaborate on the idea of recognizing nature elements as legal entities? What implication does this have for environmental laws and governance? And it is a new trend, or it has been going on for a while? Please share your insights with us.
Thank you. You're going directly to the heart of the most important challenge, I would call it, to the legal system, but also the most important transformation that would allow us to genuinely protect nature in the future. The legal systems worldwide usually recognize only humans as part of the legal system. So whatever behavior is regulated by law refers to human behavior in connection with other humans, or in between humans, in connection with nature, in connection with animals, in connection with objects in general. But it is not at this moment a significant part in the legal systems. It's extremely rare to have another perspective. That new perspective is now developed, trying to elaborate on the idea that nature elements would have legal personality, so they could be recognized as individuals that could enter into a relationship with humans. What are the nature elements that I'm trying to speak about? For instance, a forest, or a lake, or a river, or a sea. Each of them, at this moment, they are considered in the general legal framework internationally as simply elements of nature without any kind of possibility to formulate a claim, to defend themselves, or to be part into a contractual relationship. They do not have interactions with humans in the typical legal thinking. What is happening now is that in some jurisdictions is a very interesting development in recognizing to these nature elements the possibility to defend themselves. So we had court cases reported in New Zealand and in India, for instance, in which the courts acknowledge the right of a forest or the right of a river to stand in court and defend its rights. That means that, first of all, we do have rights of those kind of entities, and second of all, that they can even defend those rights in court. It's true that in court, usually they are defending two humans. Usually they are NGOs that are taking a stand on behalf of that nature element. But in general speaking, once that this could be recognized worldwide, that means that even the court itself could appoint, let's say, a special appointee, somebody who would be a curator of that nature element and defend the interest of that nature element in various court cases, in which, for instance, the nature element would try to prevent being harmed, or to try to be prevented to be polluted, or to destroyed, or in any way affected as in terms of its rights. Now, this is a fundamental change, because so far humans were so, let's put it very bluntly, arrogant in looking at relationships as only human relationships, that they were considering even, entities like animals, for instance, that can express themselves and that can even enter into a sort of dialogue with a human being as being objects, and not as being beings. In terms of legal relationships. And now we are moving to a completely different type of thinking, in which we not only that are looking at animals, we are not looking at only at entities that can express themselves very, very clearly in a dialogue with the human, but we go much way beyond that point. We go to the forests, the rivers, to the seas, to the mountains, and we try to see if they may have a saying into this context. And this is a shift in mentality that is really an amazing achievement of the current era. The thing is that it's not as new as we might believe, because in both jurisdictions, which is that I mentioned, for instance, New Zealand and India, the concept is anchored into the indigenous population beliefs and into their traditions and into the idea of the nature having a spirit, which is an entity that one can interact with. So basically it's a cycle in which we turn back into ancient traditions in order to elaborate modern legal concepts. And at this moment, I think we are facing a transition in terms of this legal concept, trying to use old concepts in order to solve modern problems. But I think that modern legal concept will arise out of this and will spread worldwide.
Emmanuel, you're on mute.
Sorry. It's very much in, at least in American jurisprudence, there is the concept of legal personhood for companies. So as you're going through that, a company owning a forest is halfway maybe in making this forest also a legal entity.
Well, the legal personhood of companies is usually already an abstraction that was developed by the legal systems in order to allow a collective representation to a group of humans that have a collective interest. Be it, for instance, the legal personhood of a corporation, but it can be of a non-governmental organization, like an association or a foundation, or they can be even legal personhood of states, nations, municipalities, etc. So the legal personhood is a concept that tries to give representation to a fiction, legal fiction, which is a group of humans treated as being one. Now, from that abstract concept to just shifting the idea of legal personhood applied to something that is not a real person, a human being, but it is something else which still have a possibility to be represented in a legal relationship, you're totally right. One can draw some similarities, and it's basically trying to keep some sort of generalization and abstractization, and then shift the anchor of that from a group of people to an element of nature. So we are still speaking about legal personhood, the concept that you're referring to.
Very, very interesting. And, for us that AKFI is really looking at bridging the gap between digital transformation and sustainability. It's such a novel domain and an amazing domain, because, as you said, it's actually anchored in traditions, in all the traditions, right? That nature, it's it has certain characteristics of a living being.
That is amazing how you actually are going towards something that is helpful in terms of nature, which is technology. Because once that we can look at some, jurisdictions in which robots are given citizenship, for instance, and we look at that concept, which is basically an object that it is created by humans, and it has a certain shape and a certain behavior. Well, not created by humans, but a certain shape and a certain behavior one can see also at a river and also at a forest, especially in this kind of situations in which they react into defending their ecosystem, for instance. And looking at ecosystems, this is a very interesting concept because ecosystem, a forest, for instance, it's an ecosystem. A river, it's an ecosystem. It's a mixture of entities that are some of them beings, some of them other type of nature elements, like for instance soil or water. But in their totality, they do behave as a stable type of interaction. And therefore, it's interesting to look at them and to conceptualize their legal personhood. It's easier for us with robots because we can make a robot speak like a person, or we can make a robot look like a person, like a human being. But a part of this desire of us to make something to look that is looking like us, if you are going to the fundamentals, which is it is an organism. Yes, it is. We are also a body of cells. No, it is something that has a self-preservation tendency. Yes, any kind of ecosystem has a self-preservation tendency, or systems that allow them to self-preserve. So if you go to some basics, then you can draw analogies that are helpful.
I think the reason we want to make robots a person is to make them pay taxes. I'm just joking.
Oh, that makes sense.
But it's interesting that you're bringing the money topic here, because the other concept that is now very much revolutionary is the concept of nature as capital. And nature as capital, it's also looking at as nature in a different element, in a different perspective that before. Namely, for instance, if you are using air, or you're using water, or you're using sunlight, for instance, these are elements of nature that usually and traditionally they were not included into the cost or into the assets of a company. And now in the last years, it is a whole doctrine, economical doctrine, but which has legal implications as well, into trying to recognize the cost of a certain company as including also the nature-related cost. How much do you consume for the elements that otherwise would be considered for free? How much impact do you have on nature? And in this respect, the nature as capital, I would say, is the next element of very strong influence into revolutionizing, let's say, the legal mentality as we have it at this moment, alongside with the nature elements as having legal personhood.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we were talking also something that I noted, I wrote it down. You mentioned in our past conversation about the predictive legal thinking. And for me, that was a new concept, and maybe you want to elaborate a little bit.
It is a new concept. We developed it at the Swiss Institute for Alternative Thinking in trying to emphasize a mentality that needs to be changed into the approach on legal concepts. Why? Because normally any lawyer would look at the elements that are certain, which is the past law, the present law, and possibly at the law that it is in the making, but in a very, very advanced phase, like, for instance, a draft law that it is already on the table of the parliament or of the government, of the Congress, whatever institution would be the regulatory institution in a specific country. So that is the mind frame of lawyers, and there are a lot of disclaimers. In every single legal opinion, you will see a disclaimer that shows that performing that kind of legal analysis, I'm looking at this law. So defining the law in terms of time and also space, like jurisdiction, for instance, it's something that is very, very typical. Now, what I believe at this moment is that we need to shift to a different mentality. And that mentality is that we need to operate with future potential evolutions of law. Why? Because impact on nature is not immediate. And we are not speaking on impacts that are to be included in a feasibility study, let's say for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. We may have impacts that go beyond generations. They maybe go in centuries ahead. Now, if you think at this kind of concepts that are long-term and projects that are long-term, then you have to anticipate in your analysis also what will be a change in law over this kind of time frame, which is a long one. For me, it was very interesting to see how beautifully and useful is the technology advancement in terms of the space industry into allowing mentality changes in terms of nature. Why? Because when one makes a project that goes beyond one generation and try to think that we are going to build something for the next centuries, we are going to try to think how we are going to live on the moon or on the Mars in 2-3 generations from now, already we can forecast generational challenges in terms of this environment in which we are right now. So with this kind of thinking that is intergenerational, then we can look also at the forecasting of the law. And when we go to forecasting of the law, it's a very complex area of forecasting, because we have to look at to which kind of social needs law is responding. And law responds usually to the social needs that are in a certain tension. So usually we regulate what is needed to be regulated, either change or resistance to change. So in any way, we try to regulate whatever it is not yet a social behavior that it is so widely recognized, so unanimous that it doesn't need rules for it. So basically, you're trying to forecast what reaction the legal system, which is the social body, will have to different kind of changes. And you have to think, for instance, if the environment will change, what kind of reactions, social reactions may be there? Which kind of regulations may be enacted? And at this moment, it is not even something extraordinary that I'm saying. When you are looking at general concepts, like, for instance, the social development goals, or if you're looking at sustainability, or if you're looking at goals in general as a declaration, if you go in that kind of concept, the sustainability on long term needs to be matched with the analysis of what the law will provide in implementing that. Because you never remain only on philosophical declarations. You always will have to implement that in some sort of resistance. And the law intervenes there. So, for instance, elements of nature as capital, elements of nature with legal personhood, impact as a monetized element into capital, are concepts that even now they are not legally recognized, or they are scarcely legally recognized in various countries. But you cannot ignore the signs that this might become something in the future. So when one analyzes a project, it should normally look at forecasting the potential legal changes of that project, because it's about implementing the expectation of increasing the protection for environment. And I don't think that in terms of, for instance, unforeseeability of legal changes, one can claim that, oops, we were somehow completely unprepared to think about change. Change is part of life, and on long term, change is already a certitude. On short term, it may be avoided, but on long term, it's a certitude. So predictive legal thinking, it's a mind frame that I think will have to be always used in any kind of feasibility studies that are looking at a resilient type of project or business or social project, whatever that might be, on long term.
very interesting. And I'm thinking a little bit about backcasting, but I'm also thinking about the departure point of this kind of long-term thinking. And I'll add two things. I know from AKFI that the ideal, because of course that's Isabella's generation. Ideal is a generation that is asking strong and persistent questions about ethics, questions about the mindset of people, and so on. I don't know if you factor this in the predictive legal thinking, but as you mentioned, the legal system reflects the social system. And, if we go 300 years back and we think of the legal system at that time, there were a lot of prohibitions that today were removed, especially relationship between genders, for instance. And I don't want to get too political on that. So is the predictive legal thinking also looking at issues like ethics, like the changes that the new generations are coming with?
When law is changing, it's usually the last thing to change. Changes are starting with philosophical or spiritual changes. They move to social movements or political type of directions. And then at some point in time, they reach the point in which law is intervening. So regulations are very late in time. Normally, when one looks at tendencies, lawmaking is the last to map, let's say, a certain territory. The first to map the territory is just the human natural inclination into that kind of relationship, and that is basically ethics as it is, the group ethics or the social body that it is in discussion. So that is the first element. Then you can have opponent groups creating or different groups created when the interests are colliding for some reason, and they create the pools of different type of interest into the same group, which initially was unitary. And then you move to the next phase in which those kind of collisions cannot be self-regulated, and they need some sort of external element to implement whatever type of decision is taken, and it is unfavorable to some of the members of the group and favorable to the others. So lawmaking, it's a late signal, I would say, of change. The first signals of change are clashes in mentalities and clashes in philosophical approaches. I know that the word sounds maybe difficult to operate with, but it's the very simple way in which I'm usually explaining it to my students is when you say I have an idea and the other one says I do not agree with your idea, then there is a why into that situation. Now, that why, the discussion about why we do not agree, that is already a philosophical discussion for sure, for some reason. Then you can enter into the, why the why, and then you move further on the topic. But usually, if you don't need more than 3 whys, the maximum in my experience, to get something that it is philosophy. Which is basically like, for instance, nature is important, or nature is something to be respected, or nature is a simple tool that we can use irrespectively. So that is already a different perspective. That is a philosophical clash, very simple, to put it like this. We do respect nature, or nature has to respect us. Clash. And in that clash, at some point in time, we need to regulate when this is embedded into different currents and different opinions. And we need somehow as a social body, either as humanity or as nations or as people in a municipality area, whatever the group is, or a corporation, the members of a corporation, we need somehow to get to a consensus. And what's very interesting is that in this area of high transformation, consensus is a word that flourished. And that is due to technology. Again, the blockchain community brought back the word consensus.
Interesting.
They made it fashionable again.
And the other word which I'll bring is conscious also. I know it semantically starts with the same, gathering, CON, right? Con. but it's the other element I think you brought in your if I can call it your method, your approach to reaching consensus, right? And I think going a little bit back on the nature elements of the legal entities, actually the human conscience has to move in that direction. The nature, we cannot decipher the words the nature tells us. We find out that trees, exchange messages. We find out definitely that animals communicate and so on, but we don't understand. We don't speak their language. So I think we rely on our conscience to realize this and enlarge actually the relationship with the nature.